2.7 million people served in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. Around 11,000 of them were women. Many roles in the military were not available to women during that time, and they were not a part of the draft. Every woman who went to Vietnam volunteered to do so. And they served where they could, in offices as translators, but the majority, over 90%, served as nurses. They worked tireless shifts and returned home to the same chaotic and unwelcoming homecoming that many of the men did.
I walked into a patient's room and the patient said, "Oh, I heard that you were in Vietnam. What was it like?" There's no way you can explain it. So I just turned around and walked out.
Their histories are essential in understanding the Vietnam War. From the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, founders of the Wall, this is Echoes of the Vietnam War. I'm your host for this week, Callie Wright, bringing you stories of service, sacrifice, and healing from people who still feel the impact of this conflict nearly 50 years later. This is episode 12. We Were Essential, Nurses in Vietnam. During the Vietnam War, women were not serving in combat roles. They still faced dangers such as disease, helicopter crashes, and mortar fire, to name a few. They also had the added danger of sexism and harassment. As a warning for younger listeners, the stories you're about to hear involve sexual harassment and assault. Edie Meek's brother was drafted, and it would push her to make a decision that would forever change the course of her life. She served as a nurse in Vietnam, becoming hoochmates with Diane Carlson Evans, another Minnesotan who would go on to found the Women's Memorial on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Campus. Edie was one of over 10,000 women who found themselves serving our nation in Vietnam during the war.
I grew up in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I went to St. Mary's School of Nursing in Rochester, Minnesota. From there, I went down to visit my brother, who was selling encyclopedias door to door in Hollywood. So that was quite a big change for me. And just decided to stay, walked into a hospital and said, do you have a job? They said, can you start tonight? It was that easy back then. While I was there, my brother was drafted and he joined the Marine Corps. And I thought to myself, if something happened to him, I would want someone there who really wanted to be there, who really wanted to take care of these guys. And so I went back to Minneapolis for Christmas. And in February, I joined the Army Nurse Corps. I was stationed at the 3rd Field Hospital in Saigon for 6 months, and I did intensive care nursing there. And then from there, I went to Pleiku, which is in the Central Highlands, and the 71st Evac Hospital, and I did intensive care nursing there.
Edie, in Vietnam, your hoochmate was a woman named Diane Carlson Evans. What was your experience like living with Diane in Vietnam?
Oh boy, well, she had been at a different hospital before, as I had, and we both arrived in Pleiku at the same time. And it was unlike Saigon, where you would hear rockets, but they were far, far away because they weren't rocketing Saigon at that time. Play Crew got rocketed pretty often. So what they did to protect the nurses was they had built the beds high off the floor so that if the rockets were coming, you could climb under the bed. And so Diane would usually crawl into my room, and the two of us would be under the bed. Sometimes more of the other gals would come. And I thought, this is great. If they hit this end of the hooch, we're really done for. We're going to have 4 nurses gone. But they didn't. But it was pretty scary sometimes. And it was nice just to have that backup. But also just knowing that Diane was from Minnesota, it was a comfort knowing that somebody from home was there.
Edie, what were some of the challenges of being in Vietnam for you?
Back then, nurses were not really what I call warriors. We were not allowed to carry weapons of any kind. Some had them, but they were not allowed to carry them. The whole attitude back then, now you have to remember that this was the late 60s and things were just starting to change for women. Regular soldiers were very, very protective of the women. And they were very happy to see, American nurses there if they woke up and had been injured. For me, it was more of the officers that you might have a problem with, because some of them felt very entitled. So you really had to get yourself out of some sticky situations sometimes. The service itself is what I consider a violent occupation. You're there because you may have to go to war. The women who are totally capable also have to deal with the testosterone that's flowing around. And they don't necessarily these days have the protections that they should have. For instance, I had a problem, but you don't tell anyone. You didn't even tell your commanding officer, the female that was above you, because she wouldn't have done anything anyway. So you just didn't tell anyone. And having it the chain of command is really not healthy, I don't think, because the commander is going to protect whatever he's got. You had nobody to go to, because they wouldn't have taken care of you anyway. It was really a lot different back then, but I think that they've allowed women to become warriors, but they haven't necessarily protected them against all of the testosterone that's flowing.
I was hoping that maybe you would speak to me a little bit about when you came home.
Well, we were told by the nurses that came in, because we didn't go as a group, we came as individuals and were inserted into different hospitals as other nurses went home. And the incoming nurses to a person said, take your uniform off as soon as you get into country, because your welcome will not be a happy one. And so by the time I left Vietnam, I was so disgusted with the Army and the government, and that I went into the bathroom in the airport, took my uniform off and threw it in the trash and put on other clothes. I was just so disgusted. And then went home. I still had 6 months left to serve, but I just threw my fatigues away, my boots, everything. The welcome was not a good one for a lot of people. Listening to some of the gals that I served with talk later on, that their reception was not the best in the world. Not only that, but what happens was, you knew when you were going to be going home. You had to work right up until the end. And so you may be working on a bunch of wounded guys. Then it's time for you to leave. You get in the bus, you go to the airport, you fly to San Francisco, and all of a sudden, within 24 hours, everything has changed. And yet your brain hasn't quite assimilated what's going on yet. And then when you get home, everybody expects you to be normal. And that for me was the big surprise, in that I was not normal. I had changed. Sometimes some of the women committed suicide. There was no place to go. I mean, I can remember hearing one of the gals talk about they went to the VA. This was early on. And what they did, they really didn't know what to do with women. So they put her in a men's Vietnam group. And what she started doing was being the nurse and taking care of these guys, which meant that she wasn't getting help at all, because our experience was so different from the guys. Ours was like the negative of the picture that the guys had. You know, whenever the helicopter would come, they would think, oh, thank God, we're getting out of here. We're going to be saved. We would think, oh, terrible, bad news. All these guys are coming in, you know. So it was like a whole different perspective. And therefore, being in the same group, you didn't share the same, you know, we didn't shoot anybody. We didn't, our sadness and trauma was that we couldn't save everybody. I mean, that for me was one of the really tough things, was that we could work and work and work, but you just couldn't save everybody.
What changed for you? What made it possible for you to share your experience?
Well, actually, I didn't talk about Vietnam, I would say, for a good 23 years. Not a word. In fact, when the Women's Memorial was coming up, and one of the local papers did a thing, interviewed me, because they had heard that I had served in Vietnam. And this woman who I'd known for 20 years came up to me and she said, Edie, I have known you for 20 years. I never knew you were there. But you really didn't talk about it, because this is a perfect example. I worked at the local hospital part-time. And before I started in the OR, I worked on the floor, and I walked into a patient's room and the patient said, oh, I heard that you were in Vietnam. What was it like? There's no way you can explain it. So I just turned around and walked out, because there was no little sound bite that you could say that would tell people what it was like. And so you didn't even try. At that time, my daughter was going to Mount Holyoke College, and she was taking a course on the 60s. And I said, is that history already? But it was. And they were doing 8 hours on Vietnam. She said, Mom, there's a guy here that teaches a course on Vietnam. And he starts the course by saying, you women will never know what it's like to be at war. And she said, being the little feminist, she said, Mom, can you come up here and talk? And I said, well, ask your instructor and see if he'll let me talk. And if so, I'll come up. I'd never talked about this before. And so I went up to Mount Holyoke, but my daughter gets up and she says, I'd like to introduce my mom, Edie Meeks. She was a nurse in Vietnam, and I'm so proud of her. And that was the first time anybody had said that. And so I started saying that I had served in Vietnam. And I said, I don't know the history of Vietnam, but I'll tell you what it felt like to be a woman over there in the service. And then I proceeded to talk. And at the very end, when we were leaving, the young women would come up and say, thank you, thank you. The very last little gal said to me, oh, Mrs. Meeks, I would have welcomed you home. And I thought, maybe it takes the next generation to really welcome us home.
Our organization, we've been talking about PTSD a lot recently. And I know that women who served certainly experienced trauma as well. Do you think there are enough services for women who came back?
When I first went to Castle Point, which is right in Beacon, actually. It's a wonderful VA hospital. And they really didn't know what to do with a woman who served in Vietnam. But they gave me this nice young psychologist, and together we worked to see what the PTSD really was for women and how it affected women. And we learned together, I think. And he was wonderful. He was really wonderful. And he sent me to the right places when it came up with the sexual trauma. He sent me to the right person to talk to, and that kind of thing. And I've always had the psychiatrists that I've had there have been wonderful. They've actually, after him, they've all been women, and they have listened. And I think I had to work out what the PTSD did to me and how it was manifesting itself in my life. Because if you had said you have PTSD before any of this, with Diane or anything, I would have said, I'm doing fine. But it builds up. And when it got to be like 20, 22 years, I was hitting the wall. So I needed help because I didn't know where to go. And you can get so depressed, and you can have suicidal thoughts and not even know why you're having them, because you think this did not affect me. I can remember going to, it was a group of some kind, and I said to the woman, because I had talked about feeling so sad and whatever, and she came up to me, and I'd never seen her before, never saw her again. And she said to me, you don't have to get over Vietnam. And all of a sudden I thought, oh, that's right. This is part of my life. Getting over it means that now that's gone, but it's never gone. It's always there. It's just how I handle it and incorporate it into my life that makes it work for me. One of the psychiatrists has said to me when I was feeling really suicidal, and she said, tell your kids this. Tell them. And I'd never thought of that, because a mother is supposed to protect the kids, I mean, they were older now. And so I said, oh, okay. And so I did. And for the next 2 weeks, they called me every day to make sure I was okay, But I thought, yeah, I can reach out and ask for help. Whereas before I was the rock, Well, I'm not. I'm just a human being. Because now I know that this is part of my life. And that I'm not alone. I don't have to just protect myself. And that's a big thing. I had a job where I had to travel a lot. I had to meet someone the next day in DC. So I got a hotel room, and I went down that evening to the wall. I could not remember any of the names of the guys that I took care of, because they were only there like a day or two. We were stabilizing them, and then they went someplace else. But I remember touching on the names of that time period, and all of a sudden I just started sobbing. And I just started saying, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry that I couldn't heal you, that I couldn't save you. I'm so sorry that you had to die. I really needed to say that to the guys. And I think this is true of many of the women, that they can remember the ones that they couldn't save, but they couldn't remember the ones that they did save.
That was Edie Meeks speaking to me from her home in Minnesota. Coming up after a short break, Nancy Wilson talks to me about serving as a Navy nurse on the USS Repose. When not working on the podcast, I get to spend some time out with the Wall That Heals, the 3/4 scale replica of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial that travels the country. It's amazing to see all of you out there visiting names, learning more about those who served, and sharing your stories with us. In fact, we met Nancy Wilson at a Wall That Heals site. So come visit us this week. We're in Carmichael Park in Brighton, Colorado. If you like us, there are a couple of easy things that you can do to help. One, you can share this podcast with a friend or family member. The other is you could leave us a rating or a review wherever you get your podcasts. You'd be surprised to know how much that little action helps us get new listeners. Until then, let us know what you think by emailing echoes@vvmf.org. Navy nurse Nancy Wilson served on the USS Repose, one of 2 hospital ships off the coast of Vietnam. Her experiences in the military and as a nurse continue to be cornerstones of her life.
When I was in high school, I worked with a doctor in the town where we lived. I worked there, did anything that I could. He taught me a lot. He took me to the small little towns where he would do surgeries, and it really piqued my interest. So I thought I was looking at hopefully becoming a pediatrician is what my goal was. And I needed to get a degree to start with. So I thought I'd start with nursing and go from that way. When I went in for my interview, the director, after talking with me, she said, I understand you want to be a pediatrician. She said, you have an attitude of caring. You don't have a cutthroat attitude that you would need for medical school. And back at that time, for a woman to get into medical school was rare. I went ahead and stayed in nursing, and glad that I listened to what she said, because I hope that I really have always maintained a caring attitude. That is the way I feel. And I hope that I portray that with whomever I interact. When I went to college, the Vietnam War was getting started and really ramping up. I decided to go ahead and take part in the Navy nurse candidate program that they had. And I was considered an E3, and I was under pay, under orders all the time I was in college, and finished, and then with the obligation to serve active duty in the Navy. And it was the best thing I ever did, as far as I'm concerned. But I retired finally a year and a half ago from nursing. So 54 years, I paid my dues.
Absolutely. What are some of the challenges that you think that nurses may have faced when they came home from Vietnam?
All hell broke loose because the best way to say it, we were vilified. They told us not to talk, not to wear our uniforms. And I didn't. I pretty much isolated myself in a lot of ways. But if somebody found out I was from the Navy or had been in Vietnam, it was really a price to pay, because I was called a baby killer. The only thing you hear was that PTSD was for the men. They were the ones who suffered. They were the ones who faced all of the hard situations, or wounds, whatever it was. That was what they had to deal with. And it didn't apply to us because we were women. And it wasn't until probably the last 10 years that I have heard anything about admitting that, oh, well, maybe women did have some problems with that. And there are a couple of groups, I don't know the total number of groups through VAs that have actually started groups for women for PTSD, or included the women in with the men, because it's real.
How do you think the role of women has changed in the military since you served?
One of the things that was really significant for us on the repose was the ship's captain he would brown nose a lot of the brass that would be around the bases. Oh, Admiral so and so is going to be there. He's got to come to dinner. And he would have 4 or 5 senior officers from different branches to his quarters for dinner. And he would then assign a nurse to be assigned to each individual officer and entertaining for the evening at the, when they're, I mean, whatever it was. And then he would go, want something on the base on land, and he would say, hey, I'll bring a couple of my nurses if I can get thus and so, a couple of my girls, as he called them. That was horrible. And we did not do this. Some of the pilots from the chopper pilots gave him the name, the Pimp of the Orient. And we understood what was going on, but he got mad because he thought we did. So he told us we could not leave the ship for a month. that was just outright not the way it should be. I think women are accepted much more for their ability. And you look at the variety of positions that women can now be utilized in different areas that they never were before. Those of us who were on the repose in the sanctuary were the only females at sea in the Navy until sometime in the 80s, when they started allowing women, one to be pilots, another to be at sea. And now it's pretty much open if they're qualified for whatever the area it is. I think that has opened up a lot more for them. But I think now, and it may be just the nature of the times that we're in, there's more open harassment. And it really reflects, I think, more society than it does military.
Nancy, how do you feel that your service in Vietnam as a nurse affected your service back here stateside when you came home?
Oh, it definitely affected it. That set the whole parameter for who I am today. What I do, how I approach patients, the willingness to learn and to work hard and to continue to always learn.
What should people know about what women contributed to the war effort in Vietnam?
I think the one thing that's very measurable is the fact there would have been a hell of a lot more names on that wall if we hadn't been there. That we did help get guys adequate care and be able to get home. That's something that really needs to be acknowledged, that we did make a difference for a lot of people. True, there were a lot more men present than there were females, but what we did was essential. The corpsmen helped us, we helped the corpsmen. We worked with the physicians, and the physicians knew they could count on us.
Nancy, one question that I want to ask is, how do you think the Vietnam War affected your generation?
I think it caused a lot of pain, for sure. And a lot of the people from my generation are bitter because they went to war, bitter because people were not supporting us when we came home. Just all over, not knowing how to readjust when they get home. Then they also were bitter because the politics that had perpetuated the war was you never knew which way to turn or what they were going to say. Oh, we'll do this. No, we do that. There was stress because we were not supported, but vilified when we went home. All of those things have caused tremendous amount of pain for Vietnam veterans, but also for all the citizens who were through that age group. The young people who traveled through growth at that time, and nobody addressed really how they were feeling, why they felt the way they did, and it just caused more bitterness.
Nancy, I actually want to ask a follow-up question on that is, do you think that those traumas that people experienced when they came home kind of compounded maybe PTSD for men and women who had been serving?
Undoubtedly, undoubtedly, it really did, and still does. That's one of the reasons, because now they're saying welcome home, but it's kind of hard 50 years later, because there's still everything of the pain was internalized, because like I said, we had to hide it. I didn't talk about Vietnam or even cry for 20 years after I got home. And the thing that opened up the show, China Beach, that was on, okay, the first episode of that came on, afterwards, I sat and cried for 2 hours. I just couldn't stop crying. We were on China Beach. So that I guess was the key that opened this up. And that was in December when that started. In January, I was asked to give a talk about nursing beyond the walls. It was an in-service they were having at Children's Hospital where I worked. That was the first time I had ever spoken about anything in Vietnam. And that really did help. And I know probably 2 or 3 years ago, my older son, who is, I guess he's 48 now, he said, "Mom, you have never talked to us about Vietnam. We don't know anything about it." And I said, "I know, I couldn't talk." I said, "Nobody knew." And I said, "I know that affected how I communicated. I made mistakes because of that, because I was afraid to let anybody know how I felt. So that made things rather uncomfortable. I did get a divorce. That was part of it, because I had never talked to my husband about it."
What do you think helped?
I think one of the major things was being able to talk about it. I think that's one thing that if people, when they come back from a war situation, any kind of a stressful situation like that, need to be able to talk to somebody that understands. That's so important. And that, I think, is some of the best advice. Find somebody to talk to. Get this out.
Thanks for checking out the official podcast from the Founders of the Wall in Washington, D.C. We publish a new episode every 2 weeks, so be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey, it's Michael. Big thanks to Callie Wright for sitting in the host chair for this episode. We'll be hearing a lot more from her in future episodes. I'll be back in the big chair for our next episode, bringing you deeply personal stories from 2 daughters of servicemen who were missing in action in Vietnam. That's in 2 weeks. We'll see you then.